Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Do I Have Time for This? The series that looks at old and new video games, both indie and AAA, to help you figure out if you got the time to play, finish, 100% complete it, or just leave it in your backlog to forever gather dust. Today, we're going to take a look at the seemingly first and only game from Korean developer Overborder Studio, Thymesia. Described by them as a grueling action RPG and described by everyone else as a Souls-like, Thymesia is a lower budget game published by Team 17, the same team which published Blasphemous. Set in the kingdom of Hermes, you play as protagonist Corvus, a plague mask wearing supernatural warrior with abilities granted through this universe's version of alchemy. In standard Souls-like fashion, we live in a ruined world beset by monsters as a result of alchemical experiments, and as you'd expect, the details surrounding this are very sparse and often learned through item descriptions. Bloodborne influence worn proudly on their sleeve, Corvus rips and tears through corrupted humans and animals alike in order to regain his memories and hopefully himself. Only then can he finally bring balance to the kingdom, if he so wishes. Although this little low-budget game starts as a heavily inspired by the numbers entry into the genre, you'll soon discover through gameplay that the pure blood of something truly great bubbles beneath the surface. After the basics are laid out to us and the obligatory hard-to-beat tutorial boss grinds us into a fine paste, we are transported to the hub world, where Thymesia takes an approach similar to Neo, where after we complete a level, we can go back to a remixed version for an optional challenge. Our guide and maiden this time is Asimi, a young girl who knows a lot about alchemy and is more or less the only NPC who will actually stop for a chat, the other being a mysterious character who looks a lot like you, but gives insight into the world's lore. We get said lore by finding key items in the world and bringing them to these two characters who exposit without voice acting for a few minutes. I'd have loved a bit more care and attention given to these lore moments, maybe something contextual and less expositional, especially when location descriptions and actual items are very hard to come by. Unlike how a Souls game would normally contain multiple sets of gear giving background to locations, enemies, and bosses, all we have here are boss souls and a few books which give us a few sentences on each. I think the level layout is a great way to add extra content without ballooning the budget, and whilst I imagine a lot of reviews would criticize reuse of assets in this way, I never found it to be much of an issue in games like Neo, and it's still not an issue here. I find if you get bored of locations in a Souls-like, the problem isn't the level, it's the combat. Speaking of combat, let's dive into the weeds on this one. Thymesia offers what I believe to be a very flexible combat system, provided you play as a singular protagonist without a gear loadout or encumbrance to worry about. The core component of the combat here is that every enemy health bar is actually two. One is the standard white health bar and the other is the wounds health bar, which is green. Your normal sword attacks inflict damage to the white health bar and a tiny amount to the green. But to do the big damage to the green health bar, you'll need to use your supernatural attacks to wound them. This is almost like Sekiro in the fact that the green bar is essentially a posture meter you're chipping away at with parries and heavy attacks. The only difference is reducing the white bar to 0 does nothing. Any white health can be recovered if the green wounds remain, and such is the unique dance of combat Thymesia provides. You can play this game in essentially 3 key ways. You can either parry everything, dodge everything, or do a combination of the two. I personally found the third option to be the most rewarding, but it's down to personal preference. The dodge is extremely generous, but doesn't inflict any posture damage at all, whereas parrying will remove some of the white health bar, essentially allowing you to just parry and heavy attack without ever really having to use R1 if you don't want to. In fact, some of the enemies are practically impervious to normal sword attacks, whereas parrying their big lumbering attacks chips away a massive portion of their white bar, leaving them open for heavy attacks. If I'm completely honest, I'm not sure where I fall on Thymesia's combat. When you pull off a load of perfect parries, follow them up with a few heavy attacks for a swift execution, it feels great. But oftentimes you'll miss one parry in a combo, then receive every single other hit and just die. I believe this is due to the way the game has its parry window slightly before other games, and is possibly just a skill issue on my part, but you really did need to hit the parry before they attacked you, and not as they attacked you. I think one of Thymesia's greatest strengths is actually its skill tree. Whilst the skills offered don't necessarily add anything out of the ordinary gameplay wise, what they nigh on insist you do is pick a specialization to your combat style, but never encourage you to stick with it. The skills cover sword attacks, parrying, dodging, use of the feathers which act as an auto-replenishing attack interruption, the claws, aka your heavy attack, and a wide range of passive buffs. The specific skills you want tend to be hidden a few layers deep in each skill tree, encouraging you to sink a load of points in it to try it out. However, there is an option at any time with no penalty to refund a specific tree of points or even all the points so you can try a different playstyle. Whilst you also have the standard leveling system, it's really in the skill tree where your playstyle changes, and I feel like different bosses and enemies benefit from different playstyles. Some big lumbering beast bosses are hard to parry but a piece of cake with dodges, whereas some knight enemies are so fast you simply have to parry them. One of the key aspects of the Steam description are the plague weapons, where our character Corvus harnesses the plague energy to create a temporary one-time use weapon from his enemy. This is something I feel is Thymesia's biggest strength and greatest weakness. The reason for this being that you can obtain any weapon from any enemy in the game temporarily, be it a dagger all the way up to a boss weapon. In doing this though, Overborder has hamstrung their ability to innovate on the enemy roster. Fighting a group of enemies, stealing a scythe from one of them, then hitting all of the enemies back with it feels tremendously powerful, and once you permanently unlock and keep them, they can be upgraded further to become a powerhouse of your arsenal. The downside comes from the fact that all of the enemies you face have to meet the criteria that you can use their weapons. As a result, enemy variety is extremely limited, and beyond bosses, you've likely seen all there is to offer by the second level. Again, this may be down to budgetary reasons, and I really hope they get a second crack at this game, only to build more on this system, but we could have had a few new spear enemies with new movesets, different types of archer enemies, or a plethora of different shield enemies, instead of the handful we got in the final game. Sadly, we are left inundated with the same annoying shield enemies at the start as at the end, and save for the elite enemies, which more or less have one or two extra moves, the fodder more or less looks identical from start to finish. With the lore describing the vile blood mixed with different creatures to make monsters, we could have had endless options much like we had in Bloodborne, but the majority of enemies are just humanoids with the occasional beast. The last piece of the gameplay gumbo is the potion mixing.
Yes, science!
You have 3 types of potion across the game: the standard potion, the long-lasting one which heals more of a time, and the fast potion which heals less but is instant. When upgrading these potions using rare items dropped from the elite enemies I mentioned earlier, you can add ingredient slots. These ingredients are random drops from certain enemies and offer extra buffs to things like health or energy recovery and taking or dealing more damage. They can be mixed and matched in any order and are reusable, but if you pay attention to the lore notes, you can find recipes for special potions in which combining certain ingredients grant huge buffs to damage, health recovery, or even XP gain. This is a fun little side activity that's a bit let down from the recipes not getting saved anywhere, so you need to dig through the notes or look them up online to find them. and certain ingredients drop rates were so low, I finished the game including all optional missions, missing 2 of the 12 ingredients. I think it would have paid to make some of them mission rewards rather than enforcing a farming session for completion. As for the bosses in Thymesia, I'd say they're reasonably challenging as you'd imagine with any Souls game. For the most part, you can more or less parry or dodge any attack, though as I said before, some bosses lean more into a certain playstyle, but I found parry to be effective on the large majority. With the second boss I encountered being a big beast, I was hoping we'd get a huge variety of bosses, but we do again see a lot of humanoid enemies, with the occasional exception with one boss being completely unlike any of the others, a welcome breath of fresh air. The only real downside of the bosses not being that memorable is the addition of unblockable attacks. Essentially, you are told in the first boss fight that there are attacks which you cannot parry, effectively dodge or interrupt, you just have to be out of the way. This doesn't seem too different from your standard AoE attacks, until you see how brief the wind-up of the attacks are. They really can half your health bar in a single hit without warning, especially the first boss. As always when it comes to more independent and smaller scale projects, visuals are never the focus. Gameplay and narrative often take center stage when you don't have the budget for 4K visuals. I wasn't particularly impressed by the opening level we get in Thymesia, and we actually returned to it as the last proper level in the game. Aping a Bloodborne style ruined town with a castle added to the side of it, was all very grey and brown, harkening back to the early 2000 shooters where the entire colour palette was just shades of taupe. The other levels though, consisting of an infected circus act up in the trees and a library overrun with crystals of blood, really did feel like their own separate biomes, conveying the stories they were looking to tell with a mix of visuals and lore notes strewn throughout the level. These two areas were a great showcase for the creativity Overborder Studio had, in terms of integrating visuals and subtle storytelling to twist your typical fantasy setting into something plague-ridden and dark. It was a real shame the enemy variety didn't match the two differing ideas. So, let's get down to it. How long does this game take? In my playthrough, I played each main story mission alongside all the optional side missions and was ready for the last boss at 7.5 hours. For the asking price, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, as it is on Steam right now at about a third of the price of a regular AAA game. When going for completion, the developers have added in some very odd achievements, which I'm fairly sure only exist to pad the runtime. The potion ingredients having a very low drop rate, coupled with reaching max level and smashing 1000 barrels, served to bring my total playtime to just under 13 hours. There's little to no replay value here, as you can simply select the answer no at the end of the game to be brought back to the hub world after the final boss to get the other endings, of which there are 5, and you can respec your skill points at any time to change your build, so there's no need to replay for that reason either. The missions themselves clock in at around 20 minutes per mission, with the main story missions lasting a little bit longer depending on your mileage with the boss difficulty. This game easily lends itself to players who enjoy a difficult game and only have a short amount of time for a play session, without the cheap death nature you often get with Dark Souls imitators. I'd say if you're a Souls fan, push for time, and you don't have 100 hours to sink into Elden Ring, this is something you can finish fairly stress-free. Ultimately, I recommend Thymesia. The world building can be a little sparse and the enemy variety is definitely lacking, but there are the bones of a compelling gameplay loop here. It's just a straightforward Souls-like experience that's just fun. The combat options available to you here, coupled with the short mission structure, ensure you don't stay in one gameplay state for too long, and always ensures you have a fresh approach to fighting, even when what you're fighting isn't that fun. The innovative idea of reaving weapons temporarily from foes to use against them is great, and whilst it somewhat hampers the enemy variety, this gets overshadowed by offering you new ways to tackle combat encounters and always makes the first thing you do when fighting an enemy a steal attack, just to see what new weapon you get and how it works. I think this was a great first attempt at a Souls-like. Thymesia mixes some world building with environment design, introduces a fresh combat system with flexible skill tree, and whilst it doesn't hit the mark with enemy or boss design, I feel Overborder understood what makes a good Souls game. I'm keen to see what they come up with next. So, do you think you have time for Thymesia? On this channel, I like to give my thoughts on the game, alongside a bit more of a deep dive on the time you have to invest, so you know what you're getting into before you load it up. because time is precious, right? If you enjoyed the video or found it useful, feel free to like and share. If you subscribe, I'm looking to put out regular content like this alongside some more in-depth video essays and freeform videos, so stick around, and if you have any requests on future videos, just drop them in the comments. And finally, if you want to come chat with me, you can find me over on x.com/gracious_rhino. I'm Gracious Rhino, look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.